Professors Sérgio Soares and Gustavo Pinto. And I'm going to present our research entitled "What Evidence We Would Miss If We Do Not Use Gray Literature." That was conducted together with Gustavo Pinto, Igor Viz, Márcio Ribeiro, and Sérgio Soares. This research will be present at the International Symposium on Empirical Software Engineering and Measurement. So, what is gray literature? It is the first question. The most common definition of gray literature, called as Luxembourg definition, proposed at the Third International Conference on Gray Literature in 1997, says that gray literature is produced on all levels of government, academics, business, and industry in print and electronic formats, but which is not controlled by commercial publishers, where publishing is not the primary activity of the producing body. Recently, Garros proposed a gray literature definition focused on software engineer research that stated gray literature in software engineer can be defined as any material about software engineer that is not formally peer-reviewed or nor formally published. So to conduct this study, we have some motivations. The first motivation is the increase of use of social media and communication channels by software engineering practitioners, that they use it to share and acquire knowledge easier and quicker. The second motivation is related to the increased use of studies that investigated gray literature source, both in primary, secondary, or tertiary studies. Among the types of the secondary studies, there is a multivocal literature review. That is a form of a systematic literature review, which includes gray literature, in addition to the published literature or traditional literature. Even the increase of secondary studies using gray literature the recent years, few studies are investigating how gray literature used properly to contribute to these studies. We identified only one study published in 2016 with this purpose. Since then, several multivocal studies have been conducted. For this reason, this study aimed to assess to what extent the use of a gray literature contributed to multivocal studies. In this research, by contributing, we mean understand to what extent the multivocal studies use gray literature evidence to answer its research questions. To achieve this goal, we employed a tertiary study to find potential multivocal studies in software engineering research area. Thus, we proposed a set of strategies. One of those was to determine the scope of the multivocal studies that we would search. We chose to include only multivocal studies that followed at least one version of Garros guideline. Why this scope is important? Why this limit? We used this because the studies that follow the guideline tend to be more structured. The first version of Garros guideline was a preprint published in 2017, and the second version was officially published in 2019. The year of the first publication, a preprint version, was used as a start point to search for the reference. And as our investigation started in 2020, we used the year of 2019 as endpoint. We used the Google Scholar to search for the studies that cited one version of Garot's guideline, at least one version. This study was conducted in five phases, as shown in the figure. At the end of this process, we select 9 studies to deep investigated. For the data extraction and analysis, that was the phase 4 and phase 5, we designed a process divided into 3 main activities. The first, to identify primary source, the second, to identify gray contribution, and the third, to investigate the impact of gray literature in multivocal studies. Each activity was composed by a sum of steps. In the following, I will explain our process used. The first activity consisted to identify primary source and collect information about them. Some multivocal studies did not classify or use a separate list to include the reference of the study. We need to find them. We need to manually find them. First, we searched for the primary source on the multivocal studies. Then we counted the numbers of each group of studies. This group is separated in traditional literature and gray literature. After we extracted the related data and stored then the information in a spreadsheet. Then in the last step in this activity, we search for related reference in the study and store this information. So in the second activity, we aim to identify the gray contributions properly. Thus, we look at the reference stored to identify how gray literature was used in the study. Here we look at that for the text, figures, tables. We intend to investigate the gray literature used, its types, the types of contributions. In the third activity, we investigate the impact of gray literature in each study and compare the finds of the studies with traditional literature. So now I will present our finds that were distributed into 3 main research questions. In the first research question, we intend to investigate how complex it is to employ gray literature in multivocal literature studies. Here we have the 9 studies included at the find of the process, with the total in this column, with the total of gray literature included as primary source. 4 studies in which gray literature source represent more than half of primary source included caught our attention. For instance, the multivocal study 4 and multivocal study 3 and 5. Well, we also investigated the number of research questions that each study have and how they were answered using gray literature source. We did find that most of the research questions were answered using gray literature together with traditional literature. What caught our attention to this question was the number of research questions answered exclusively using gray literature source. For example, 2 studies. In 2 studies, this happened. For instance, the Multivocal Literature Review 4 and Multivocal Literature Review 6 were answered using only gray literature source. In our second research question, we investigated how related to properly contributed to multivocal studies. We identified in total 384 related sources. We classified each graded source to identify each contribution using open coding based on thematic analysis technique. In this process, we involved 3 researchers. We identified 10 types of contributions. We will talk about for the top of the contributions that we identified. The recommendation was one of the most common types identified, present in almost 80% of the studies. For instance, in the study, the multivocal 5, we have recommendations for conducting test code reviews through detailed video tutorials. Creator was also used to explain some topics, concepts. The explanation was also one of the most types of contribution that we identified in the studies. For instance, in the study Multivocal Literature Review 2, a Creator source explained how DevOps contributed to achieve the project objectives. We also identified great literature that was used to classify several information. In this regard, extracted quotes as examples for this case was more difficult because most were present in tables or figures. We also identified that great literature was used to contribute with some solution proposals. For instance, the solution to a maturity model for maturity model for DevOps lifecycle was proposed in Multivocal Study 2. Here we have another type of contribution based on opinions. We identified contributions based on opinions retrieved from some great literature source. This case, we have the opinion that they include personal opinion. Our last research question, we aimed to understand the types of great literature included in multivocal studies in their producers. We identified 19 great literature types among the multivocal studies. From the total of 384 related sources investigated, blog posts, slide presentations, and project and software descriptions were the most common. Here we present the relation between the great literature type and the type of contribution. In this relation, the second and the third columns caught our attention, related to contributions of recommendations and explanations. As we can see, recommendations was most identified in blog posts and guidelines, and explanations in blog posts too, and technical reports. Here we found that blog posts were the most common related type that contributed with opinion, to give you opinions. Finally, it caught our attention that few contributions identified related to programming, such as examples of using source code, or some explain some techniques of coding. We expected a few numbers for the last group for empirical contributions, as we have known that academics do not produce the measure of great literature. Talking about the producers, we try to list most of them. Here we have how each type of producer contributed to each great literature type. We identified that practitioners, consultants, consultor companies, or into vendors produce more than 75% of the great literature source that we investigated. Software engineer practitioners were the ones who produced more blog posts, webinar articles, quest and answer website, and weekend tries. The second group that more produced great literature, related produced more great literature, was the consultants or companies that were mainly related to blog posts, and slide presentations, white papers, technical reports, and many other types and videos. Two vendors were the most type of producer that were related to project and software descriptions, as you can see, and contributed also with slide presentations, and with white papers. With this study, we identified some challenges investigating related contributions in the 9 studies investigated. We proposed a set of recommendations to deal with each challenge. The first challenge is related to the difficulty to identify and classify great literature source. Greater source included in the multivocal studies. Thus, we recommended that researchers classify the greater source according to their type. And it's important to understand. To understand better how each type of great contributed with these studies. The second challenge is related to the lack of related information. We recommended to the researchers include much information as possible about the great literature, for instance, the type of great literature, the type of producer, the year of the source, and the web link of the source, because we identified that some related source that in which the web link were not provided. So the third challenge is related to the difficulty of identify and classify related contributions. We recommended that researchers conduct a separated data extraction, separate traditional literature and great literature source, and always highlight the difference between great literature and traditional literature on the synthesis of this, the synthesis and the conclusions. So to conclude my presentation, we have some conclusion about our studies. With these studies, we identified that related was used to contribute with several recommendations, explanations, some solutions proposals, and opinions. We identified that Green literature contributed exclusively to some of finds, and Green literature supports several finds found in traditional literature. And we identified that Green literature was produced by a diverse types of producers. So that's it. Thank you.